Next, I want to talk about climate classification. How do we classify these different climates? So here's a figure from the book, but boy, it's really busy. There's a lot going on here, a lot of letters. We've got these broad categories, but they have these big categories: A, B, C, D, and E. And then there's also one called Highland, and that's more just complicated if you're in a mountainous environment. But and different classes or different textbooks are going to call these different things, but they use the same letter codes. A, these are tropical wet climates. B are dry climates. C are wet mid-latitude climates, but they're mild. And D are more of an extreme wet climate, like in Russia or Canada, places like that. And E are what you get at, say, Antarctica. These are polar climates. So I'm just going to use some other slides just to kind of illustrate, just with a few maps and pictures, what these are like. And the A climates, these are tropical climates near the equator, such as in South America, Central Africa, Southeast Asia. And these are places that are fairly warm throughout the year and fairly wet. These are places, for example, where you have tropical rainforests. You also have lush savannas of grasses and tall trees. And in some parts of the world, these are very important for the food supply because there are places where rice is grown. Next are the B, or the dry climates. And you find these include both grasslands and desert climates. The darker color here are deserts, and the lighter color are grasslands, like the Great Plains and the Central Valley of California. These are places that don't get as much rainfall, and so they're drier. They can either be real deserts, like here in the Mojave or the Sonora Deserts, California, or they can be open grasslands. In many places, the grasslands may not even be there. They may have been converted to agriculture or other uses, but this is sort of what they would be naturally. So for example, this is in the Great Plains. You have going from drier, shorter grasses to wetter, taller grasses. Next are the sea climates. These are moderate but wet climates, like in Washington and Oregon, the Sierra Nevada, Eastern US, and Europe, Asia, other places. These are wet but not very cold. And these are pretty mild. So you have, maybe deciduous trees that shed their leaves, very green environments, but they're not that extreme. One in particular is Mediterranean climates. And these are dry summer climates that you find in California, the Mediterranean Sea, and a few other places in the world. And we'll be talking about Mediterranean climates as we go on in the course. These are a subset of the sea climates. So these are environments like we might see in California, such as chaparral vegetation. These are shrubs or oak woodland. So even if you drive a little bit into the foothills near Fresno, you might see these sort of oak woodland type environments. Next are the D climates, and these are wet but relatively cold environments. And we find these in places like Canada and Russia. One thing about them is that they're typically limited to the northern hemisphere, because at the latitude that they're at, 60 degrees north, if we go south here, not a lot of land there. So really Canada and Russia are the two places, what we call these continental or D climates. One note about vegetation in D climates is that they're really limited to what we call coniferous forests. So we're going to be talking about boreal forest or the taiga in Russia. And these are huge expanses of the sort of Christmas tree looking trees that exist in these cold areas like in Russia and Canada. Lastly, we have very cold areas, including places at high elevation, like in the Himalayas. And in some places we have pure ice, like in Antarctica and Greenland. In other places we have what's called tundra, and tundra are places that are cold, but in treeless plains that are not always covered in ice. So these are some examples of cold environments. This is tundra, extremely cold, treeless plains, but not covered in ice. Some places are covered in ice, like in Antarctica, and some places are cold at high elevations.